At 11 o'clock on the morning of December the 19th, 1944, a group of men sat in silence inside a cold stone building in Verdun, France. The room had once been a French army barracks. Now it was barely heated, its bare walls sweating with winter damp. A single stove struggled against the cold. The breath of the officers around the table hung visibly in the air. Outside, snow clung to the ground. Inside, the war was slipping out of control. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had called this emergency meeting after 3 days of disaster. The German army had smashed through the Ardennes. American divisions were collapsing. Entire units were retreating in confusion. Bastogne, a critical crossroads, was surrounded. If the Germans reached Antwerp, the Allied front would split in half. Eisenhower looked down the table and asked a simple question. How long would it take to stop them? When he turned to George S. Patton, the answer came instantly. 48 hours, 3 divisions. The room went quiet. Patton did not explain himself. He did not qualify the statement. He did not hesitate. And in that moment, every man in the room understood the same thing. If Patton was wrong, the war in the West might be lost. In the early years of the war, the German High Command believed it understood its enemies. They had studied the British for decades. British generals, in German eyes, fought methodically, carefully, too carefully. They prepared thoroughly, advanced cautiously, and rarely took risks without overwhelming force. The Americans were something else entirely. To the Germans, the U.S. Army was new, untested, and predictable. Its officers were thought to be inexperienced, its doctrine rigid, its movements slow and overly dependent on supplies and schedules. German intelligence reports from North Africa and the early fighting in Europe reflected that confidence. American generals were not feared, they were managed, and George S. Patton barely registered. Early German intelligence files mention him only in passing, an energetic commander, outspoken, aggressive, perhaps even reckless. A personality, not a strategist. Certainly not someone to reshape a war. This mattered. The German army had built its entire way of fighting around one core belief. Wars were decided by speed, initiative, and the ability to act faster than the enemy could think. Blitzkrieg was not just movement, it was psychology. Shock the enemy, disorient him, never let him recover. Against that doctrine, the Allies seemed ill-suited. The British were deliberate, the Americans were procedural. Patton, at this stage, appeared to fit neither threat nor pattern. And so, when German commanders planned their defenses in France, when they calculated Allied responses, when they imagined how the next battle would unfold, his name was rarely spoken. That assumption would not survive the year. George S. Patton did not learn how to fight the Germans during the war. He had been preparing for them for most of his life. Long before American tanks rolled through France, Patton had become obsessed with a single idea. Speed decides wars. Not firepower alone, not numbers, speed of movement, speed of decision, speed of exploitation. Between the 2 world wars, while others treated military theory as an academic exercise, Patton studied it as a personal creed. He read German manuals, he devoured the writings of Clausewitz and the Prussian General Staff. He followed the evolution of armored warfare in Europe with intense focus, but he did not simply copy German ideas, he absorbed them. Patton understood what many Allied commanders did not yet grasp, that Blitzkrieg was not just about tanks or radios or aircraft. It was about anticipation, about moving before the enemy had finished reacting to the last blow. He believed hesitation was fatal. A pause allowed the enemy to regroup. A delay invited resistance. Momentum, once lost, was almost impossible to regain. This belief shaped everything he did. Patton demanded aggressive reconnaissance. He insisted on constant movement. He trained his officers to make decisions without waiting for perfect information. Acting fast, he believed, was almost always better than acting perfectly. To many of his peers, this made him dangerous. To the Germans, once they noticed, it made him familiar. Patton was thinking about war the way they did. In the summer of 1943, George Patton finally had his battlefield. The invasion of Sicily was meant to be a proving ground for the American army, and Patton was determined to prove everything at once. His Seventh Army moved fast, aggressive, and relentlessly forward. Roads were seized before the Germans could organize. Ports were captured ahead of schedule. American columns raced British forces toward Messina in an unspoken competition for prestige. To the public, Patton became a hero. Newspapers celebrated his victories. His speeches were reprinted across the United States. His image, polished helmet, ivory-handled pistols, came to symbolize American confidence and momentum. For a brief moment, it seemed his instincts had been fully vindicated. But speed and aggression carried a cost. Patton demanded everything from his men. He had little patience for hesitation, fear, or exhaustion. To him, war was brutal, and weakness, real or perceived, endangered everyone. That belief led to disaster. During visits to field hospitals in Sicily, Patton encountered soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue, men who had endured weeks of shellfire, death, and sleepless terror. To Patton, they did not look wounded. They looked like cowards. He struck them. The incident spread quickly through the medical staff. Reports reached Eisenhower. The reaction was immediate and severe. Patton was ordered to apologize publicly. His behavior was condemned. Quietly at first, then loudly. When the story reached the American public, outrage followed. Patton was removed from combat command. The general who had embodied American aggression now sat idle, disgraced, his career seemingly broken. To the Germans, he remained what he had always been, a loud, reckless commander, finally undone by his own excesses. He was deliberately hidden. In early 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, their greatest fear was not German strength, it was German awareness. If the enemy discovered where the landings would come, the invasion could collapse before it began. Normandy was the real target. But it was not the obvious one. The Germans expected an attack at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. That was where their defenses were strongest. And so, the Allies decided to feed that expectation. Operation Fortitude was born. A fictional army was created on paper, the first United States Army Group. It existed only in reports, radio transmissions, and carefully staged illusions. Inflatable tanks filled empty fields, wooden landing craft crowded quiet harbors, fake headquarters buzzed with scripted radio traffic. And at the center of it all stood George Patton. To German intelligence, his presence was decisive. They knew his reputation from North Africa and Sicily, aggressive, relentless, always at the point of attack. The idea that the Allies would sideline Patton for a secondary operation made no sense to them. If Patton was in England, then England must be where the real invasion would come. German spies reported his movements. Double agents reinforced the story. Intercepted radio messages confirmed it again and again. Even after Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6th, Hitler remained convinced that Patton's army would strike at Calais. So German panzer divisions waited. For weeks. They waited for an army that did not exist, commanded by a general who was not allowed to fight. For George Patton, the summer of 1944 was a test unlike any other. While Allied soldiers fought and died in Normandy, Patton remained in England, commanding an army that existed only in imagination. Every instinct he had pushed him toward the front. Every lesson he believed in demanded movement, pressure, exploitation. Instead, he waited. He inspected fake camps. He posed for photographs beside inflatable tanks. He delivered speeches to units that would soon vanish into the real invasion force, carefully ensuring that word of his presence spread. The deception worked almost too well. German intelligence tracked Patton obsessively. Reports of his supposed army flowed steadily to Berlin. Hitler himself remained convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversion, that the real blow, led by Patton, had yet to fall. For the Allies, this hesitation was priceless. German armor stayed frozen in place. Reinforcements that might have crushed the beachhead never moved. But for Patton, the cost was personal. He watched as others commanded the great battles of the war. He knew his name was spoken, but not in the way he wanted. Not as a commander in motion, but as a symbol in a lie. The general who believed speed was everything was being forced to stand still. And the pressure was building. On August 1, 1944, George Patton was finally released. The Third United States Army was activated, and with it, Patton returned to the war in the only way he knew how, at full speed. The timing could not have been more dangerous or more perfect. Just days earlier, American forces had torn a narrow hole in the German front during Operation Cobra. What lay beyond it was open country, rolling terrain, exposed roads, and a German army already straining to recover. Patton did not pause to consolidate. Within hours of taking command, his forces were moving in multiple directions at once. Armored columns surged west toward Brittany. Others drove east into the heart of France. A third push secured the southern flank. There was no single line of advance, no cautious buildup. Patton believed that predictability was the enemy. If the Germans could not determine where the main blow was coming, they could not stop it. For German commanders, the change was immediate and deeply unsettling. This was not the American army they thought they knew. This army did not stop to regroup. It did not wait for perfect supply lines or neatly secured flanks. It moved, bypassed resistance, and kept moving. Within days, the tempo of the war in France had changed, and the Germans were struggling to keep up. What followed in August 1944 stunned both sides. Patton's Third Army did not advance like a traditional force. It surged. Columns of tanks, trucks, and infantry flowed across France in wide arcs, exploiting every gap the Germans failed to seal. Strong points were bypassed. Isolated resistance was left behind for follow-on units. The objective was not to destroy every enemy formation. It was to keep moving faster than the enemy could react. Entire German units found themselves cut off without ever fighting a major battle. Roads that planners expected to be contested for days were crossed in hours. Towns woke to find American tanks already on their outskirts. German headquarters lost contact with their own front lines, unsure where the Americans were or where they were going next. The psychological effect was devastating. German officers reported that American armor was appearing where it was not supposed to be. Defensive positions prepared over weeks were rendered useless overnight. Orders arrived too late. Counterattacks struck empty ground. Patton encouraged this chaos. He gave his commanders standing instructions. If you meet resistance you cannot immediately overcome, go around it. Do not stop. Do not wait. Keep moving. Speed became a weapon. In less than a month, the Third Army advanced. Farther than most armies moved in an entire campaign. Cities that had endured years of occupation were liberated in a single day. For the German army, this was something new. They were being outmaneuvered, not by superior numbers, but by relentless momentum. To many observers, Patton's advance across France looked reckless. An army moving that fast over that distance should have collapsed under its own weight. Tanks without fuel were useless. Infantry without ammunition could not fight. And every mile forward stretched supply lines thinner. Patton understood this better than most. Behind the speed was an obsession with logistics that surprised even his critics. He did not treat supply as a limitation. He treated it as a weapon. Fuel dumps were pushed forward before armored units arrived. Ammunition was stockpiled along projected routes of advance. Quartermasters were ordered to anticipate demand, not react to it. When official supply channels proved too slow, Patton authorized improvisation. Captured German fuel was seized and immediately put to use. Civilian trucks were commandeered. Damaged vehicles were stripped for parts to keep others moving. Nothing that could carry gasoline or ammunition was allowed to sit idle. Even so, the pace began to exact a price. By early September, the Third Army had outrun its supply system. Fuel became critically scarce. Tanks that had crossed half of France in weeks now sat silent, engines dry. The advance slowed, not because of German resistance, but because movement itself had finally reached its limit. Patton was furious. He believed the moment was slipping away, that Germany was closer to collapse than anyone realized, that with just a little more fuel, his army could break into Germany itself. Instead, the pause gave the Germans something they desperately needed: time. By late autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe seemed to slow. The rapid advances of summer were over. The front lines hardened. American and British forces dug in along a broad arc stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. After months of constant movement, there was a sense, mistaken but widespread, that Germany had been broken. Patton's Third Army held a long, thin sector along the eastern edge of the Allied front. It was quiet there, too quiet. The Ardennes forest was dense, rugged, and cold. To Allied planners, it looked like poor ground for a major offensive. Narrow roads, steep terrain, deep woods, the kind of place armies avoided in winter. So it became a rest area. Inexperienced American units were rotated in. Veteran divisions were pulled out to refit. Defenses were light. Intelligence reports warning of German activity were dismissed as exaggerations. Patton was not convinced. He believed the Germans were wounded, not finished, that if they struck again, they would strike where they were least expected. Quiet sectors, thin lines, bad weather. He ordered his staff to quietly prepare contingency plans, just in case. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, the silence in the Ardennes shattered. German artillery opened fire along a wide front, shells crashing into American positions buried deep in the forest. Within minutes, infantry followed. Then, tanks. Entire German armies surged forward under the cover of snow, fog, and low cloud. It was the largest German offensive in the West since Normandy. American units were caught completely off guard. Communications failed, roads clogged with retreating vehicles. In some sectors, soldiers woke to find German armor already behind them. The plan was simple and desperate. Hitler intended to split the Allied front in half, drive to Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. Speed and surprise were everything. If the Germans could move fast enough, Allied strength would never have time to respond. For a moment, it worked. American lines bent, then broke. Towns fell. Units dissolved. Bastogne, a vital crossroads, was surrounded. To many Allied commanders, the situation looked catastrophic. But to George Patton, it looked familiar. This was exactly how he believed the Germans would fight. 3 days after the German offensive began, the Allied command gathered in Verdun. The choice of location was symbolic. Verdun had swallowed entire armies in the First World War. It was a place where offensives went to die. Now, once again, the fate of Europe seemed to be tightening around it. The mood in the room was grim. Reports from the front were incomplete and often contradictory. Units were missing, roads were jammed, German spearheads were still advancing. Bastogne remained surrounded, its defenders running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Eisenhower needed options. He turned to the commanders around the table and asked how quickly forces could be shifted north to meet the crisis. The answers were cautious. Days, possibly weeks. Winter weather, damaged roads, and exhausted units made any large movement risky. Then Eisenhower looked at Patton. Patton did not hesitate. He said he could attack in 48 hours, not reposition, not reinforce. Attack. The room fell silent. Patton was proposing to disengage an entire army, pivot at 90 degrees in the middle of winter, and strike a moving enemy, faster than the Germans themselves were advancing. If he failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. But Patton did not explain. He simply waited. Patton's confidence at Verdun was not bravado. It was preparation. Weeks earlier, long before the German offensive began, Patton had become uneasy about the quiet sector in the Ardennes. He did not trust stillness, he did not believe the enemy was finished, and he never assumed the Germans would fight where it was convenient for the Allies. So he planned. Without fanfare, Patton ordered his staff to draft contingency operations for a sudden German attack. Routes were mapped, road capacities calculated, fuel requirements estimated. Alternate axes of advance were sketched out in advance, then refined. These plans were not shared widely. They were not approved by higher command. They simply existed, waiting. When Eisenhower asked his question at Verdun, Patton did not need time to think. He already knew the answer. Within hours, orders were moving down the chain of command. Units were alerted. Supply columns were redirected. Traffic control teams were dispatched to critical junctions. Maps that had been theoretical the day before were now operational. The Third Army began to turn. Entire corps disengaged from the front under cover of darkness. Convoys rolled through snow-covered roads, headlights blacked out, engines straining in the cold. Men slept in trucks. Drivers stayed awake for days. It was one of the most complex maneuvers of the war, and it was already underway. What Patton attempted in December 1944 went against nearly every rule of large-scale warfare. Armies were not supposed to pivot in the middle of combat, not in winter, not on damaged roads, not while facing an active enemy. Movements of that size were planned months in advance, not executed in days. Yet the Third Army began to turn north. Columns that had been facing east now drove through sleet and snow toward Luxembourg and Bastogne. Traffic jams stretched for miles. Vehicles broke down in the cold. Men went without sleep as units passed through narrow towns, never meant to handle an army on the move. Everything depended on timing. If the Germans moved faster, Patton's forces could be struck while still redeploying. If roads collapsed into chaos, the attack would fail before it began. If Bastogne fell before relief arrived, the maneuver would lose its purpose. Still, the army moved. Patton drove his commanders relentlessly. Delays were tolerated only if they were unavoidable. Hesitation was not. Every hour mattered. Every mile gained was pressure applied to the German flank. For German commanders, the attack came as a shock. They expected the Allies to react slowly, to stabilize the line, to defend. They did not expect a full-scale counterattack, launched from a direction they believed impossible, led by an army that had already disengaged and turned before they knew it was happening. The German timetable collapsed, and with it, the momentum of the offensive. By the third week of December, all eyes were on Bastogne. The small Belgian town had become the hinge of the entire German offensive. 7 major roads met there. If the Germans held it, their advance could continue. If they lost it, the offensive would begin to unravel. Inside Bastogne, the American 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. Supplies were running low. Wounded men filled cellars and makeshift aid stations. German artillery pounded the town day and night. When the Germans demanded surrender, the answer was brief and defiant. Nuts. But defiance alone would not hold forever. As Patton's Third Army drove north, resistance stiffened. German units, now aware of the threat to their flank, rushed to block the roads leading to Bastogne. Snow slowed movement, fog grounded aircraft. Every mile forward was fought for. Patton's lead elements pushed on regardless. On December 26th, tanks of the 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines and reached the perimeter of Bastogne. The siege was cracked. Supplies began to flow. The defenders were no longer alone. The German timetable was broken. What had been planned as a lightning strike was now a grinding fight, one the Germans could not afford to lose. The German offensive in the Ardennes never recovered from Bastogne. Once Patton's Third Army broke through, the initiative was gone. What followed was no longer a bold gamble, but a slow retreat under relentless pressure. German units that had raced west only days earlier now fought desperately to escape encirclement. And inside the German high command, something had changed. For the first time in the war, American operations were no longer described as clumsy or predictable. Reports spoke of speed that defied expectation, of movements that came too early, from the wrong direction, with no pause in between. Captured German officers were blunt. They did not speak of Patton as reckless. They did not dismiss him as theatrical. They compared him to their own best commanders. General Günther Blumentritt later explained that Patton understood modern warfare instinctively, that he moved the way German doctrine demanded, fast, decisive, always pressing the advantage before the enemy could respond. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was even more direct. He called Patton the most dangerous Allied commander they faced, not because he had more men, not because he had better equipment, but because he acted faster than they could think. Patton anticipated instead of reacting. He attacked while others were still organizing. He accepted chaos and forced the enemy to drown in it. To German commanders raised on the principles of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, this was deeply unsettling. They were being beaten at their own game, and they knew it. George S. Patton did not live to see the end of the war. In December 1945, just months after Germany's surrender, he was killed in a car accident outside Mannheim. The man who had survived artillery barrages, armored battles, and years at the front died in silence, far from any battlefield. He was buried in Luxembourg, among the soldiers of the Third Army. It was a deliberate choice. Patton had always believed that a commander's place was with his men, not above them and not apart from them. In death, as in war, he remained among those who had carried out his impossible orders. History would remember his flaws, his temper, his recklessness, his refusal to bend. But his enemies remembered something else. The German generals who faced him did not remember the speeches or the pistols. They remembered the speed, the shock, the sense that once Patton began to move, there was no time to recover. In a war defined by machines, logistics, and mass armies, George Patton proved that one thing still mattered: the ability to act faster than the enemy could think.